Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on today's webinar. We're just going to give a couple minutes for folks to join us in the Zoom webinar, and we will get started in just a moment. Again, welcome everyone to our webinar. At this time, I would like to introduce our interpreters who will be doing live translation into Spanish, Jennifer Santiago and Mary Hernandez Castellanos. And I'd like to invite Mary at this time to explain the translation function before we begin.
Muy buenas tardes. El día de hoy vamos a tener interpretación disponible. Yo soy Mary y vamos a tener a Jennifer también. Si están en un teléfono pueden ver los 3 puntitos en su pantalla, eligen el idioma de español, ponen su audio original en silencio y ponen listo o done. En su pantalla, si están en una computadora, van a ver un mundito. Ese mundo le da la opción del idioma español. Eligen mudar original audio y ahí van a poder escuchar a mi colega Jennifer en español. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Mary. And we'll also be dropping in the instructions for the translation to the chat for the folks who joined us late and would like to access the translation interpretation services. All right, let's get started. So hi, everyone. Again, thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Gabriela Barbosa. I'm a policy director at the Children's Partnership. It's a statewide children's advocacy organization that has been dedicated to improving the lives of California's children for over 25 years. Through policy, research, and community engagement, we are committed to ensuring that every single child, particularly those from historically oppressed and marginalized communities, have the resources and opportunities that they need to thrive and achieve their dreams. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion on policing and its harmful impacts on child health and well-being. This webinar is a part of a series of briefs that the Children's Partnership is releasing, focused on examining the impact that racism has on child health and the way that racism continues to shape the conditions in which children live, learn, develop, and play. Just a couple of announcements before I introduce our moderator and our panelists. First, we will be sharing a recording of the webinar at the conclusion of the webinar. We also have enabled the chat and Q&A box and really encourage folks to engage with each other in the chat and ask questions through the chat and the Q&A box. On audience questions, we will be reserving 15 minutes at the end of today's discussion so that we have the ability for our panelists to answer any questions that you all might have and bring up. Great, so I am so honored to introduce our moderator and panelists for today's conversation. Myra Alvarez is our moderator today. She is the president of the Children's Partnership. She combines her decade of experience at the federal and state level in healthcare policy and community outreach with her personal conviction that every child and family should have the opportunity and resources to pursue their dreams. Upon her leadership, TCP is building strong community partnerships, conducting forward-looking research, and advancing informed policy that betters the health and well-being of marginalized children in California. Myra began her professional career as a health policy fellow in the office of then Senator Barack Obama. She completed her graduate education at the School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her undergraduate education at the University of California, Berkeley. Next, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our panelists. First is Mark Philpart, who is the Managing Director of PolicyLink, where he leads the PolicyLink Boys and Men of Color team and is the Principal Coordinator for the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, the nation's only statewide network improving outcomes for boys and men of color and overseeing the development of new strategic PolicyLink partnerships and projects that contribute to the overall health and success of boys and men of color, their families, and their communities. Mark holds master's degrees in public affairs and public health from the University of Washington in Seattle and earned his BA in history from Xavier University of Louisiana. Next, we have Dr. Rhea Boyd, who is a pediatrician, public health advocate, and scholar who researches, writes, and teaches on the relationship between structural racism, inequity, and health. Dr. Boyd also works clinically and has a scholarly focus on the child and public health impacts of harmful policing practices and policies. Additionally, she is the Director of Equity and Justice for the California Children's Trust, an initiative to advance mental health access for children and youth across the state of California. Dr. Boyd earned her MD at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine and completed her pediatric residency at the University of California, San Francisco. Finally, we also have Amir Whitaker. Amir is policy counsel at the ACLU of Southern California. Prior to joining the ACLU, Amir represented students and incarcerated youth throughout Florida and Alabama for the Southern Poverty Law Center. He has worked as a researcher with the UCLA Civil Rights Project and has written for Time magazine and other publications. Often referred to as Dr. Knucklehead, Amir was arrested at age 15 and eventually expelled from school. In 2014, Amir started Project Knucklehead to inspire vulnerable youth and help them reach their potential through education, music, art, and other programs. He received his doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Southern California and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Miami and his bachelor's from Rutgers University. Great, so Myra, I'd actually like to hand it back to you to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. That was a wonderful introduction and just a clear reminder of how fortunate we are to have our panelists with us. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. The entire team at the Children's Partnership is honored to host today's conversation, an important discussion that aims to make clear how systemic racism is a root cause of child health inequities. And we're beginning that discussion with a focus on policing in our country. We know from the experiences of our community members, of our families, from countless examples of health inequities data, and from research that racism impacts every stage of child development, beginning in the womb and at every stage of child and adolescent growth. During this critical time of racial reckoning across our communities and across the country, we are proud to launch a series of briefs that highlight the pervasive impacts of institutional racism on the health and well-being of our children. In doing so, the Children's Partnership aims to build understanding and awareness around the many institutions in our society, from law enforcement to medicine to technology, that each perpetuate grave harm to the healthy development of Black, Indigenous, and people of color children, and therefore all children in this country. Through that awareness, we look forward to aligning with our partners on this webinar, to the many of you in this audience, as well as many others, as well as community leaders, to advance opportunities to disrupt oppressive systems, defer to community leadership, and demand bold innovations that put the well-being of our children first. Today's conversation intentionally places a child lens on issues of police violence and continues a discussion outlined in a recent brief we released that we hope will contribute to the incredible work led by BIPOC organizers and racial justice advocates for years. Advocates like those we are fortunate to have with us today. So I'm excited to dive into the conversation and get started. So I'm going to direct our first question at Dr. Boyd. My first question is to you, given your extensive research on this issue. When we consider the issue of policing and its impact on our children, how does systemic racism play out within this institution of policing in our country? And in particular, talk to the audience about its impact on kids and young people of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Native American youth.
Well, first, thank you just for having me, Myra, on this panel and for posing this question and writing this brief, because it's so critical that people understand the health impacts of policing. And I also just want to thank my co-panelists before we even start, Mark and Amir. It's really an honor to be alongside you having this conversation. So one of the ways that I frame the impacts of policing on child's health is to think first about the impact that policing has on caregivers. I start with that frame because one of the core exposures that shapes a child's health, development, and well-being is their exposure and their relationship with their caregiver. That caregiver may be a parent, it may be a grandparent, it may be an adoptive parent. But if that caregiver, for any reason, is removed from that child's life, these are things that we call adverse childhood events. They cause toxic stress. Toxic stress is kind of physiologically, in terms of our bodies, some of the most toxic or serious exposures you can have that shapes not only how a child's health is during childhood, but also their health in adulthood. And so policing is a type of exposure that disappears caregivers. It disappears caregivers into the carceral state when caregivers are arrested as a result of a police encounter. It disappears caregivers into the healthcare system if a caregiver is injured and suffers a prolonged injury or disability as a result of that encounter, such that they have to be cared for in skilled nursing facilities, for example, as has recently happened with Jacob Blake. And policing disappears caregivers when caregivers are killed as a result of those encounters. So I frame it that way because it's important that we realize that kids need not even be present when police interact with critical members of their family and their social network for it to profoundly affect their health as children and as they move into adulthood, which is also a helpful way to understand how racism plays a role, because we know those exposures are more common for children of color, particularly Black children, Indigenous children, and Latinx children and families.
So I want to follow up on that point that children don't need to be present to be impacted by these experiences. And Mark, part of what the brief highlights and what you all have worked on, what we've been witnessing this past year, is the vicarious trauma that ensues as a result of witnessing violence or being part of the audience of people that have to be subjected to these experiences. Talk to us a little bit about your work and how you are seeing children are also vicarious victims of police violence and how it impacts in particular their mental health.
Thank you, Myra, and to the panelists. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. This is a critical topic. And for our work, I support a network called the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, and we do a tremendous amount of statewide advocacy on these issues. For young people, in particular young people of color, many of them are living in neighborhoods of deep and concentrated poverty, where they are disproportionately impacted by policing. Their neighborhoods are part of, dragnet policing policies where they're more likely to be in contact with police officers than children from other communities. And because of these disparities and these inequities, they're more likely to have a heightened sense of concern for their well-being. With the advent of social media, it's been very apparent that, policing and the impact of policing can be fatal. We see it via social media, via videos. It is everywhere around us. And for young people who are kind of coming up within this dynamic of both seeing via social media someone who can be killed over the course of 8 minutes of having a knee compressed on their neck, I think there are some real challenges that result from having that experience of witnessing that, and also then being in a situation where you're in a community that is likely to be policed and bring you into contact with an officer who could very well put you in a similar position. And so, we hear from young people all the time within our network, within the youth organizing groups that we work with, that they're afraid, that they're concerned, that they are always on alert. And, that has an impact on how well they do in their school circles and how well they perform academically, but also how well they develop and just what impact those kind of elevated cortisol levels tend to have on their development. And so I think this conversation is all too often overlooked. I'm very glad that we're having it, and hope that we can do more to address the root causes that are impacting these young people and causing for this disproportionate kind of police contact, as well as what needs to happen in response. With that, I'll turn it back to you.
No, that's great. And actually, I'm going to try to connect something that both you touched on and Dr. Boyd, because you're talking about how neighborhoods are policed. And Dr. Boyd, you mentioned caregivers disappearing. Bringing those two concepts together, many of our kids, the majority of their day is spent in school. And thinking about caregivers in school and who are their protectors and who are their go-to people in the safety of a school is often a place where policing shows up. It's not only an issue on our streets, it's also in our communities, and in particular in schools that impacts those caregivers. A 2019 report that we were fortunate to cite in our report from the ACLU revealed that 14 million students are in schools with police, but no counselor, nurse, psychologist, or social worker. So it's clear that systemic racism is showing up in decisions about resource allocation and budgets. So I'm going to direct this next question to you, Amir, given your extensive work in this area. Tell us a little bit about what policing in schools does to the life trajectory of students of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Native American youth, and how it's negatively impacted by the police presence in their schools.
Thanks, Myra, and thanks, Children Partnership, for hosting this great, important conversation at this time. As the other panelists have mentioned, just the presence of police has an impact on students. And I talk with far too many students here in LA, where we're based, that are greeted or were greeted by police cars and police officers when they step into school. And they can tell you many incidents involving police, but they can't tell you the last time they maybe talked to their counselor or other staff. So as you mentioned, our report found that millions of students are in this situation, despite the increased mental health needs of all people, but especially our young people, the increased anxiety rates, the increased suicide among young people. In California, we're seeing what they call suicide clusters, where even affluent communities are dealing with this increased mental health need. But what we see is students of color in their schools don't have the support they need. And that's translated into long-term consequences for some of our youth, some of our clients. In Riverside County, where we sued last year, where one of our clients was actually grieving and showing those behaviors, associated with someone who lost a family member in school, and instead of being given a social worker or support, they were placed on what's called voluntary probation. And other students that have, had their behavioral health needs or their mental health needs responded to by police officers. So it's a huge issue that, one day a temper tantrum could follow a student for the rest of their lives and basically alter their life trajectories. Now at this time, I wanted to bring some more context to the conversation. I have here now just some of the numbers specifically for California, because as you mentioned, 14 million nationwide, but almost 23% of those students are here in California. You see, according to federal data, we had almost, about 1,000 social workers, but over twice as many law enforcement officials in our schools. So here in California, 2,000 law enforcement officers. And we actually have a tool that I'll share the link for that allows you to see this at the county level. For example, if we came down to LA County. Let's see here. Sorry, this is always difficult to do. 400,000 students, 400,020 students, or 30% of students are in these type of schools that have police, but no nurse, social worker, psychologist, or counselor. And again, we're in an international pandemic, and for schools to be set up this way really harm students and can have long-term consequences. And it's not just LA County, almost 40% of schools in Orange County, almost half of schools in San Bernardino County are set up this way. So, I'll share this link as well. But really quick, before I pass it over, I wanted to bring some student voices into this, because an organization called Students Deserve did a great survey that collected, 5,500, almost 5,500 responses from students. And it found 86% of them, support defunding the police. and the students have ideas of where they want the funds to go. You see, you know, full-time counselors, you know, psychiatric social workers and others. So the students are very vocal, and they actually have the right to demand what they want to see in their schools. And just some more data I wanted to share. From the student survey, they found actually some of the girls were reporting being sexually harassed from police officers. So we know that has another long-term impact, and just other dynamics with the police that show that they're not trained and prepared to support our young people. So thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that information. I think folks in the audience will be very interested in learning more about those numbers, especially when we can break it down by county and really see firsthand what the impact is given the population size in California. So thank you for that. You know, I'm just going to open up a question, and that is, there's a choice that's made. There's a choice between counselors, mental health professionals, social workers, and police on campus. And I won't even begin to pretend that I know the decision-making factors that go into that choice, but it is a choice. So any of you can answer this, but how do financial investments in policing, whether it's law enforcement or school police, depending on how a school decides to make the decision or investment, how does that impact then the investment in resources that could directly support child and youth and health and well-being? And what do you think is going into that decision-making process that enables 14 million students across the country to have police in their schools, but not the resources that they need to support their health and well-being?
If I can chime in here, I think Amir laid it out really well in terms of just kind of painting a backdrop. And what we know is that our budgets are moral documents. They're documents that are statements of values. And these are choices. These are decisions that we've made collectively as a society to invest in policing and law and order versus, you know, the support services that young people need. And we've done it in, you know, ways that I think are based largely out of fear. You know, during the 80s and 90s, when we saw the expansion in policing across many of our communities, it was largely rooted in this super predator model of like thinking about our young people and thinking about people of color in particular, and thinking about our neighborhoods and communities as threats instead of in need of support. And so a lot of what has happened is a result of, you know, a spear-based mentality and a desire to protect and be safe, but not really thinking about the repercussions of long-term kind of investments like what we are seeing now in terms of investments in policing. And so what we believe we have an opportunity to do is, you know, kind of sit in this moment and reflect on what is the society that we really want, and what are the investments that we need in order to thrive, in order to flourish. And we know that while some people may argue that policing is what keeps them safe, we know that over time and the sustained safety that we need, it's not going to be found in policing. It's going to be found in the support services that we need in terms of counseling or support services, social services, housing, jobs, the things that actually allow people to have their needs met on a daily basis. And so we've been advocating for a change in priority, a change in values, and really trying to get people to rethink how we situate our budgets in ways that allow young people and all people to get those services over and above punishment and over and above policing. And we've made some inroads. Amir spoke to voluntary probation. That is one example of, you know, I think a huge success, both in LA County and in the LA Unified School District, where voluntary probation was indefinitely ended, but also in the passage of AB 901 this past year, there's been a statewide focus on ending voluntary probation. And now young people will have the option of getting other community services, other support services in times where they might face challenges, rather than getting probation as a response to any set of issues that they may face on campus. And I think we need to do more of that throughout, not just in schools, but also in community. Instead of meeting some of these issues with policing, think about how we might be able to redirect some of those resources to the support services that people actually need and get at the root causes.
If I could add one thing to that, I would. Oh, Amir, were you gonna?
No, please.
Thank you. I was just gonna add one thing, that I think there is also this ongoing concern within schools that around police shootings, or school shootings, excuse me. And I think the reason that some schools justify this budget for police and not other supports is to respond to school shootings. And so I also think it's important to acknowledge that there's no data that having police in your school actually decreases the incidence of school shootings. And that's really critical. We don't have data that tells us that having police in schools actually keeps kids safer. But what we do have data is that having police in schools has an adverse effect on the children in those schools, and particularly the children of color in those schools, who are often then subject to punitive forms of discipline that then put them into that school to prison pipeline. So one of the things I think that we have to start challenging is this assumption that having police in general keeps people safe, but especially in the setting of a school. Because when it comes to where we place our investments, we know that one of the drivers, or one of the risk factors for a school shooting, is an unmet mental health need in a student at your school. And to know that then your school would use those funds that they could use to make sure your mental health needs are met, to instead protect in the event that when your mental health needs are just in a crisis moment, that then there might be a response, I think shows that we are not also taking a preventative, proactive stance to our concerns, our legitimate concerns about school shootings. Instead, we are taking this reactive stance that is frankly ineffective.
All right, thanks for that, Dr. Boyd. And just adding to that, I dropped another link to a report that relates to this issue, because police don't have a positive impact on students, and students in California have the right to evidence-based approaches to their education. So just this year, we published a report looking at school districts and their spending in what's called like the LCAP, or local control accountability plans, where just down here in Pomona Unified School District, last year, students came to us and saw that the district wanted to spend $2 million of these supplemental and concentration funds that are intended for high need students, and they have the right to. They wanted to spend these funds on police, which was unlawful. And the students reached out to us, and we helped them redirect those funds. Now the $2 million went into counselors, and they're actually, you know, full-time counselors at different elementary schools and different things, as opposed to police officers. But unfortunately, our report found that this is going on in over 40% of school districts throughout, just in the 3 counties we looked in, LA, Riverside, San Bernardino County. So students have a right to their resources, to evidence-based practices, and police are not a part of that. And that report can help communities and help educators in that fight.
Absolutely. Mark, are we going to say something?
If I can just briefly add, and this is why the work of networks like the Dignity in Schools Coalition has been so important. You know, community organizations working to get police out of schools, like the Black Organizing Project in Oakland, and like the work of Coleman Advocates in San Francisco, and a whole host of others. You know, it's really clear that schools will use whatever resources they have in order to further their addiction to law enforcement, and severing the contracts altogether and just drawing a hard line in terms of not having police in schools at all has been the best approach.
Absolutely. And that actually leads me to this next phase of questions around, youth leadership and involvement in these issues that has really made significant movement, especially in these last months and year of activity. Amir, you mentioned some comments of young people elevating their needs and using their voice to demand better from their school districts. Mark, you mentioned the Black Organizing Project. We referenced their leadership in our report. But cities across the country, Oakland, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, there's a number of cities across the country that have started to really push the envelope on this issue and move towards a reallocation of resources. Mark, let's talk a little bit more about how young people really are embodying resilience in the face of police violence in their communities, and what is that translating into as far as actions on the ground?
Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and I want to start by saying youth have they've always been resilient, especially BIPOC youth, and they've been at the forefront of battles against injustice, from the civil rights movement and the freedom rides to the largest protests in our country's history, or even in the world's history this past year, and so. Their leadership, I think, has often been cast as resilience, but resilience is a tough word to swallow, because it often means, despite the attacks on your safety and on your livelihood, we want you to be strong. I think we need to maybe reframe that a bit and think about the way in which youth leadership has just been emboldened and more empowered in this particular moment. And we have an obligation as adults and as other people who are, in communities with young people to help and carry the mantle. This is not a set of problems that young people have created, and yet they are leading in very powerful ways to address these issues. And so I think that is an important frame to hold. And we've seen these campaigns, as you mentioned, across the country to divest police, to get police out of schools and to reinvest those resources in the things that youth need. In particular, young people are lifting up youth development as a framework for how they would like to be served by systems impacting their communities. And I think that's very powerful to use a youth development orientation to be able to guide how our systems are responding to their needs. And the most powerful example of this that I'm aware of and just recently saw was just the LA County Board of Supervisors' decision to really kind of take young people out of the purview of probation, right? And I think that is such a powerful indicator for all of us to be paying attention to and thinking about as we think about what young people need and how they can lead, and what are the ways in which we need to be providing care and support, not punishment.
That's right. So let's keep on that and trying to ensure that as we're considering how to prioritize care and community and love for our young people, I'm hopeful that we are moving in the direction of solutions and progress for our communities as a collective. But so much of the damage has been done. We've done, decades and centuries of damage to our communities that really needs to be repaired, needs to be reconciled, and needs to be prioritized, as we think about what's happening in the future. And I think piled on top of all of the pain that many of our communities have experienced is this pandemic that they're living through and are experiencing disproportionately. So I'll open it up to the panel. What does the repair work that needs to be done for these communities look like? And for the policymakers in the audience or staff of policymakers, where do you begin the prioritization of that repair and then the work that follows?
First, I could weigh in here to say, it's important that we frame what we're coming to understand as a society, but what communities who have been over-policed have known for decades and centuries at this point. is that we have an epidemic of police violence in this country. And in the middle of our national epidemic and global pandemic around COVID, these are actually two epidemics that compound each other. We call that a syndemic. These are not two things that are happening in parallel, just coincidentally at the same time. We know that communities that are over-policed also have increased rates of chronic illness. Specifically, there's data from researcher Ali Silwell that tells us that if you live in a neighborhood where police kill someone and you're Black and Latinx, and the person that was killed was an unarmed civilian who was also Black or Latinx, you are more likely to have diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, right? All conditions that are also related to the physiology of inflammation and stress. And I'll also say that was particularly true for women in those neighborhoods. So if we know that this pandemic is also made worse in populations who have higher rates of those same underlying conditions, then we have to understand that being over-policed also makes your population more at risk and more vulnerable to complications in the setting of this current COVID pandemic. And so I say that this is a public health crisis, truly, because these issues are compounding each other, and our failure to address the harms of policing on individuals, on families, and then on communities and populations has implications for how our nation is going to recover and heal from this pandemic. So I think the work to end police violence is, frankly, a part of the work to end the effects of this pandemic. And the last thing I'll say is, if we're going to think about places to start, I think one place to start, in addition to the ways our health system is revving up to take care of the physical health needs of all of our patients, it's to also be more attuned and ramp up the way our health system cares for the mental health needs of our populations, right? Like during this pandemic, 70% of African Americans have been estimated to have lost someone they know to COVID. 70%. We as a nation have experienced enormous loss. We are all grieving. Then there is also data to tell us that if police kill someone who's unarmed in your state, who's also Black, the Black folks who live in that state have an enormous mental health burden within the 3 months following that police killing. That's in your state. That's not even somebody you knew or somebody on your block, just in your state. So we also know that the mental health burden of the pandemic and of our epidemic of police violence also compounds the mental health needs of everyone right now. And so if there was a place we as health systems are going to place our investments right now, I would say it's in increased access and increased supports for everyone's mental health.
Absolutely. Amir or Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that. Our students they issued a survey to students that actually found just that the uprising and the racial crisis and just seeing the injustices and not having space in their schools actually increased their mental health needs. And going back to the question of, what has to happen, just a lot of healing, a lot of addressing the past, but the problem, part of the problem is the current situation keeps, repeating the traumas, right? We still keep seeing new hashtags. We still keep seeing police walk free without justice, right? So like, I think about some of my experiences. I still myself, when driving lawfully with no problem at all, get tense when I see a police car because I've been pulled over so many times. The first and only time I've seen someone inflict violence on my mom was a police officer. I've seen police officers abuse my dad's uncles, and so there's historic trauma that has to be healed as well, but we also need to stop replicating the trauma. And just really quick, we were talking about the young people. I want to share the link to a petition that our young people led. They're at ACLU at action.aclu.org/CA care not cops. And you'll see pictures of our young people holding banners that say counselors not cops. The young people, this is a petition to state legislators, state leaders, the governor, and others who are Youth Liberty Squad have been calling this message, counselors not cops, since May with Mental Health Week. So if folks could sign that petition, that would help support as well.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I just want to build on these powerful comments and say, you know, especially thinking about the personal kind of toll and impact, right? You know, I grew up in South Central LA, and while I live in Oakland now, you know, it was commonplace to experience the types of things that Amir just spoke to. And for young people who are growing up in that dynamic where, you know, you're over policed and often in fear of, you know, police violence, it is a thing that you carry with you. You know, I've been followed numerous times on the way home by police just coming from school. And, you know, it's the type of thing that you become accustomed to, but it's not something that should be normalized. There are, I think, really powerful ways in which young people are leading that are protective factors around some of this, you know, because we talk so much about how this is happening to people. You know, young people are very active agents of change, which is, you know, I think good for their health, right? And also, you know, builds their ability to, you know, take the circumstances that they're given and then try to change them through their own leadership, which I believe is really an important piece to not lose here. We are, you know, having this conversation and trying to shed light on the way in which policing impacts young people, but young people's leadership and their ability to really change this dynamic in a way that is both good for them, but also good for their communities is important because they're being transformed through this process and transforming the places in which they live. And just finally, on this piece about repairing the harm, I so want to echo what Amir said about we can't begin this process of repairing the harm until we stop the harm. And we have to acknowledge it, and then we have to stop it. And then we have to do what is needed in order to fix it and invest in the things that people actually need in order to thrive. And so that can't be said enough. And I just want to keep repeating that part.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that I know I'm walking away from both the research that we've been able to collect, but this conversation is, you know, we've got an advocate with us, we have a lawyer with us, and we have a pediatrician. And each of you are bringing the same message, power, and voice about the need to really break down silos in order to better serve our kids and young people, right? Talking about mental health in schools, talking about safety in our communities, talking about how it relates to the trajectory of not only the well-being of young people, but their academic success and their transition into adulthood and how interconnected these issues are. So I'm very grateful for this conversation and that. And I want to, before we transition to audience questions, I want to dig a little bit deeper and ask you all, you know, what are the policy opportunities on the horizon? I think this year has been trying for everyone, and especially trying for communities of color, Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities that have been disproportionately impacted by, to Dr. Boyd's, you know, comment, that this endemic that is occurring. But I want to believe hope is on the way, right? It's hope in the young people that have led the way. It's hope in our policymakers, and frankly, the narrative shift around these issues that we're seeing that we haven't seen before. At the national level, you have initiatives like the BREATHE Act, like the Counseling Not Criminalization Act. There are efforts moving forward at the state level. Many of you are engaged in specific policy proposals that, again, demand better solutions for our young people. So how can we, those of us on this panel, but those of us participating in this conversation and that will engage in this conversation moving forward, how do we work together to reimagine public safety? And what are the policy changes that we could potentially pursue?
I'm happy to start and talk about some of the opportunities at the state level. And we do this work in partnership with grassroots organizations, youth serving organizations, and advocacy groups like the ACLU. And so many of the things that I speak to, we're doing in partnership with folks like Amir and others. I also want to give a little context because young people have done a tremendous amount already in terms of advocating for statewide reforms that I think are important to lift up. One is, securing the right to be able to film police and police misconduct. In California, young people fought for that. They fought for an expansion of Miranda rights. They fought for the ability for data on stops to be accounted for. They've also fought for use of force data and also use of force amendments, which restrict the type of violence that police officers can mete out in our communities. And so there's a tremendous amount that's already been done, but there's so much more that needs to be done. On the horizon this year, we're looking at police decertification. California is one of only 5 states in the country that don't have a police decertification scheme statewide. And so you have officers kind of like roving from department to department. If you're fired from one department, it doesn't mean that you can't be a cop, so you can go to another department. And that kind of leads to challenges that we see where, police murder is a rampant set of issues that is just kind of going unchecked, if you will. We're also advocating for the Crisis Act, which is a grant program to support community-based alternatives to law enforcement responses to emergencies. And that is something that we hope will succeed this year. We're advocating for the Vision Act, which would limit ICE transfers so that people who are undocumented, who have spent time in the criminal legal system, aren't able to be just handed over to ICE upon exit of the system. And instead they can, after having paid their debt to society, re-enter and go about their business. And so, these are some of the things that we're excited about, some of the things that give us hope because they allow for communities and families to be whole and to be free from violence and to enjoy the type of safety that we've been talking about. We're also trying to find ways to divest from the criminal legal system and invest in our communities. We're looking at the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act resources, over $100 million in grants that usually go to probation throughout the state for prevention of crime, trying to get those dollars to community organizations. We know that once those monies go to probation, they don't prevent crime, they actually deepen the entanglement that young people and other people of color tend to have in the system. So those are just some of the things we're fighting for, and we hope that you'll join us. You can find more out about some of those efforts on the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color webpage as those campaigns get underway in the upcoming year.
Great, thanks, Mark. Dr. Boyd, I'm interested in your thoughts, thinking about our healthcare system and the challenges within it itself. But where do you see some hope and opportunity in thinking about how we can dismantle these systems and really break down silos in order to prioritize child well-being?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think Mark outlined really well, I think, many of the effective policy solutions that youth advocates and other community groups have been working towards. I think on our end in healthcare, we've honestly benefited from some of that work, and we've been applying those frames to what we talk about in healthcare. So specifically around like police-free schools, as much as we're calling for learning environments that are free from the punitive surveillance of policing, we are now also calling for, advocates and I are also calling for police-free hospitals, that there might be places where people can have sanctuary from exposure to policing and to ICE. I think I have been remiss in this conversation not to be more explicit about the ways that certain families' exposure to police and certain children's exposure to police are absolutely shaped by their immigration status. And so, you know, when we're talking about Latinx families for whom that is often or likely the case if you're in a mixed status family, I think we're also talking about all the immigrant community who has also been subject to the terrorization of ICE or ICE raids in workplaces or ICE raids in homes. Those have direct impacts on the health and well-being of kids. And so in addition for calling for an end to ICE raids, we are also trying to call for areas of sanctuary. And in healthcare, I'm hoping that healthcare spaces can be a part of that sanctuary, because just as schools fund police officers or have contract with local police departments, so do hospitals. The security in hospitals are sometimes armed, they are sometimes employed by the local police department, or they're their own police department. And so we also have to divest from that infrastructure. There's a great example, and I'll drop a link in the chat, that's happening right here in San Francisco from advocates through our health department to call for our county hospital to divest from police and to end the relationship with the county sheriff's office, and to then reinvest that money into de-escalation services for hospital staff, so that if there is conflict in the hospital, that there need not be a call to an armed officer to de-escalate that we as healthcare providers can do it on our own, but also to bolster all of the supports that we have in our safety net here.
Appreciate that, definitely. Okay, it's about 10 minutes before the hour, so I want to transition over to audience questions and invite Gabriela back to join us. But I think there's no shortage of opportunities to advance solutions together, just on the list that was shared by Mark and the ideas that were shared by Dr. Boyd. And hopefully the multiple ideas that will continue to be generated as a result of young people leading the way and our community voice being elevated. So I'm going to hand it over to Gabriela to open us up to the audience.
Thanks so much, Myra. We've had some questions come up in our Q&A. I want to highlight one comment and question that came from Brilliant Minds Youth Foundation, highlighting this issue around advocating for police-free schools, but getting huge pushback from those school districts because it appears there's no cohesive plan for schools when school resource officers are off campus. So can one of you speak to a prototype or model to follow that shows how our schools will look without school resource officers?
Sure, I can start with some of that, and thank you, Brilliant Minds. That's a great and really important question. You know, I like to start with this by just saying, what did we do 2 generations ago, right? Not that long ago. I think our imagination is often limited to like this post-super predator view of our schools. But, you know, just in the 1970s, there were only, I think, 200 school police nationwide. Now here in LA, they have twice as much as that in one school district, right? And there are over 20,000, literally over 100 times as many police in our schools now, because we've seen just everything from billions of dollars coming from the federal government to put police in schools, and just an improper response. So I think we have to think back to, you know, what happened when 2 knuckleheads got into a fight before. Like, we de-escalated, we bring them together, call the parents and different things like that. You know, I've heard principals say they're going to call the police when students get into fights. So I think it's sometimes talking with our educators who sometimes maybe feel like they don't have the tools. So that same training on de-escalation and just, you know, adolescent development is really key. But this is a very important question. We have to look at the specific community because, for example, here in LA, most of the time when they call the police, it's related to suicides. So police aren't trained to respond to suicides. You know, rest in peace to Daniel Hernandez, who was shot this past summer, related to mental health. When police respond to mental health needs, they respond the way they're trained to do. So I think it's looking specifically at what the police are responding to and just pointing to alternatives. And I'm sorry, I don't know a model that's doing it right, unfortunately, and that's what we're fighting to do.
And I will just say that in Oakland, they're wrestling with this very question right now and trying to revise the school safety plan as a result of the decision by the school board to remove police from school and to close the Oakland Unified School District Police Department. This is collective work that needs to occur with everybody weighing in about what they need to be safe. And I think that it's hard to create a cookie cutter model that, you know, just kind of presumes to know the answer to that question without really digging into and understanding the nuances of a specific community. I will say that at the state level, we're also exploring a bill that would essentially no longer require mandatory notification of police for some of the issues that might happen on a campus. Right now, there are many instances where police are notified or required to be called, and school administrators and teachers should have the flexibility and the discretion to be able to determine when they need that kind of support, and also be trained in understanding ways to de-escalate and ensure safety that doesn't rely on law enforcement exclusively. And so I think that there are lots of different things that can be done, but wanted to outline that briefly for you.
Thank you for that. This other question just came in and really touches on the point that was made at the beginning of this panel around how children are also vicarious victims of police violence when their caregivers are impacted. And so this question is, do any of you have ideas of ways that civil rights lawyers or others, anyone, can help support the children of incarcerated parents in a systemic way? They are often not even an afterthought to government actors, yet Dr. Boyd hit the nail on the head in the beginning of this panel. Open to anyone.
No, I'll just say that is a critical issue. You know, I myself, who was someone, many of my Christmases, I had neither parents, and I have an organization, Project Knucklehead, we're working this holiday season to, you know, give gifts to youth who have parents who are incarcerated. And we don't see enough work in this area, I will say. And we know this is one of the ways in which they measure trauma, right? On the ACEs assessment, you know, they ask you those questions, and one is, do you have a parent that's incarcerated? And our government knows that, you know, when they were separating families and taking children away, it was with the intent to traumatize and harm them, right? So thank you for this question. I think we just have a lot more to go. I know sometimes it's tricky identifying the students themselves because, you know, it's not public information, so they would have to share it. But there needs to be more outreach and support of these students.
I'll just say also, I know of a few community groups that are made up of young folks who have a parent who's incarcerated, who are also acting in advocacy to try to limit the effects of the carceral system on their own lives and lives of families like theirs. So I think maybe connecting with groups like that might be useful. And from our standpoint in the healthcare side, we've also advocated for group visits for youth who have parents who are incarcerated, because part of what parental incarceration does is it breaks down that social network that kids rely on for their social and emotional and physical well-being and development. And so healthcare providers and other child-serving providers, even if you work in a school environment, bringing those kids into community with each other, like these community groups are doing, and their families into community with each other, can also help provide some of the social supports that can be so critical why folks go through those challenging times.
Thank you so much for that. We do have a couple of questions left, but I do want the panelists and our moderator to have a moment to provide last comments if they would like. So Myra, I'm going to hand it back to you, but also to say to our attendees that we will be sending out this recording and a bunch of resources for you all based on the conversation today. So if we haven't been able to answer your question, hopefully those resources will be able to.
Great, thank you, Gabriela. I'm going to hand it right over to our panelists for their closing comments. Just want to extend our deepest appreciation for your time and your guidance and your continued partnership in this important fight. We are your partners in ensuring that we're doing all we can to prioritize the health and well-being of our most marginalized kids. And we won't stop doing this work until they're healthy. So we're honored to work with you. So I'll hand it over. I'll go in alphabetical order by last name. So Dr. Boyd, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you guys all for having this conversation and for the work that all the groups who are, watching with us today are also engaging in. The last thing I'll say that I didn't think I got time to touch on is a lesson that I learned from Diamond Reynolds. Diamond Reynolds was the girlfriend of Philando Castile, who recorded his brutal murder and had her daughter in the backseat. And I had the honor of speaking with her, and she shared something I don't think we frame enough. So what I'll say to end is that the families who are directly affected by police violence, either because they were direct witnesses or because their loved ones were injured or killed as a result of those encounters, often face increased scrutiny on the other side of that encounter. Instead of us all wrapping our love and care and referrals and support and resources around those families, particularly for Black families and particularly for Black mothers, they sometimes on the other side of that feel judged. They sometimes feel that their family composition is judged. What was your relationship to that person? The choices that they made in that scenario can feel judged. And so I'll also try to just shift our frame from considering those who are like direct witnesses and those who indirectly witness and those who are kind of affected by the spillover effects, as we say in research, of police violence, to also think specifically about the ways that we have come to understand and sometimes over scrutinize Black caregivers and Black parents as they try to deal with the effects of police violence on their own lives. I think we all want to extend more grace to all of us who are affected by this horrible epidemic, but specifically as systems leaders, we want to think of ways that we proactively reach out to those families and ensure that they have the physical and mental health supports that they need immediately following those events and in perpetuity in the future to make sure that they're well cared for.
Thank you.
And I'll close by just saying thank you, and that this issue of state violence and over-policing that BIPOC communities face is a byproduct of structural racism. And the issues that need to be addressed, I think, are absolutely a public health priority, but they are also a priority for every discipline in our society. And it'll take a collective effort in order for us to be able to move forward and address them in the way that they should. And it should be done in a way that allows people to be whole, that allow families to be whole, and that allow the type of repair and reparations that we've talked about to happen in real meaningful ways. Thank you all for joining.
Namir.
Likewise, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Children's Partnership, and thank you to both of my co-panelists for the work that you do in partnership. Thank you for the questions, because we acknowledge that this is a complicated issue. We acknowledge that our society has lots of issues with violence and other things. I saw one of the questions ask about, like, what about community members coming to school, right? Protecting students from outside people. Sometimes that's the purpose of police. So we've inherited this system that of policing and racial control built from slavery and oppression, and we have to reform it to keep us safe, or just think of something really different that could really keep us safe and prioritize students and safety without the threat of violence. And to continue this, we just hope that we continue this work, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you again so much to our panelists for sharing your time and expertise with us, and to our audience for joining us. We will follow up with more information and look forward to working together to address these challenges and prioritize the health and well-being of our young people. Thank you.
Thank you.